The stench of cordite and hot oil drifted back into the open cockpit as Oberleutnant Klaus Weber pulled his Messerschmitt Bf 109 out of its cannon run, the English Channel convoy below trailing black smoke and scattered lifeboats like broken teeth across steel-grey water. What happened in the skies over Britain during the summer and autumn of 1940 would determine whether Nazi Germany could invade the British Isles, or whether Hitler's war machine would face its first decisive defeat. For the young pilots of the Luftwaffe, this wasn't just another campaign, it was the aerial duel that would decide the fate of Western Europe. Weber wiped sweat from his eyes as he climbed back toward his squadron, the acrid taste of cordite still sharp on his tongue. Below him, the English Channel stretched like a liquid battlefield, its surface disturbed by the wakes of British convoys that had become the opening targets of what German High Command called Kanalkampf, the Channel battles. It was July 1940, and Hermann Göring's air fleets were flexing their muscles against Britain's coastal lifelines, probing for weakness before the real assault began. From his base at Marquis Soest, Weber had watched over 2,400 German aircraft marshal across 3 Luftflotten air fleets that stretched from Norway to occupied France. Luftflotte 2 under Kesselring controlled the crucial Pas-de-Calais sector, while Sperle's Luftflotte 3 held the western approaches. Far to the north, Stumpf's Luftflotte 5 waited in Norwegian fjords, their crews convinced they would face only token resistance when the time came. The mathematics of aerial warfare were unforgiving, and Weber knew them by heart. His Bf 109 E3 had a ferry range of 660 kilometers, but over London, if they ever reached London, he would have perhaps 10 to 15 minutes of combat time before the fuel warning lamp forced him to turn for home. The Reichsmarshal's promises of quick victory rang hollow when measured against such brutal arithmetic. In the crew quarters of Kampfgeschwader 53 at Brussels-Evere, bomber crews were already learning the weight of their burden. A Heinkel He 111 could carry up to 2,000 kilograms of bombs, but its dorsal greenhouse canopy turned the aircraft into a literal greenhouse on hot days, with temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius during climbs. The men flying these missions would sweat through their leather jackets before they even crossed the French coast. The Dornier d'Eau 17, nicknamed the Flying Pencil, for its narrow fuselage carried a lighter bomb load but promised speed and agility. Its crews had learned to trust the aircraft's nimble handling during the victories in Poland and France. The Junkers Ju-88A1, fastest of the German bombers, could haul 2,000 kilograms of ordnance while outrunning most interceptors if the fighters could even find them. But it was the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber that carried the psychological weight of German air power. The screaming Jericho trumpet sirens had terrorized Polish bridges and French strongholds, but Weber wondered if that same terrifying wail would become a death song over England, where radar towers and radio networks could vector fighters to any target with mechanical precision. Those brown lattice radar masts dotted the English coast like a steel web, their chain-home towers reaching 110 meters into the sky. German intelligence had photographed them, analyzed them, even bombed a few, but the damned things kept working. Weber had heard the stories from reconnaissance pilots. You could crater the buildings around a radar station and see the aerial arrays still turning, still watching, still denying the Luftwaffe the gift of surprise that had made their previous campaigns possible. The Messerschmitt Bf 110 Zerstörer destroyer units were already learning hard lessons about the reality of air combat over Britain. These twin-engine heavy fighters looked formidable on paper, with their long-range fuel tanks and heavy armament, but in practice they became flying targets when British Spitfires and Hurricanes fell on them like hawks during vulnerable turning fights. The survivors described a terrifying moment of realization. The aircraft designed to escort bombers needed escorts themselves. As July melted into August, the preliminary skirmishes gave way to serious preparation. Hitler's Directive Number 17, issued on August 1st, authorized full-scale air attacks to force Britain to negotiate. The document explicitly forbade terror bombing as long as it is not necessary for military success, a restriction that would not survive the coming months of escalation. August 13th was designated Adlertag Eagle Day, the much-hyped knockout blow that would begin with coordinated strikes against RAF airfields and aircraft factories. But even before the operation began, weather delays and coordination failures plagued German planning. Some bomber groups would launch into thick cloud cover and never find their primary targets, a morale sapping beginning to Hitler's promised Eagle strike. Weber checked his fuel gauge and felt the familiar knot in his stomach that every Luftwaffe pilot learned to carry. The channel stretched 20 kilometers below him, 20 kilometers of cold water, where a disabled fighter became a tomb. German air-sea rescue units flew Heinkel He 59 float planes marked with red crosses, but they logged channel water temperatures of 15 to 17 degrees Celsius. Without a dinghy, survival time was often less than 30 minutes. Can you imagine strapping yourself into a machine, knowing that mechanical failure meant almost certain death in icy water, while ahead of you waited an enemy who had already proven they would not break easily? The summer of 1940 was about to test every assumption the Luftwaffe had made about air power, and Weber was flying straight into the heart of that test. Above the Channel, Eagles and Hawks were gathering for a battle that would determine whether Britain would stand alone or fall. But first, the Eagles had to survive their own ambitions. The sweet smell of aircraft dope mixed with glycol fumes and human sweat as Hauptmann Friedrich Müller cranked his Messerschmitt's canopy closed, the morning sun already baking the cockpit to over 40 degrees Celsius on the grass strip at Marquisost. Eagle Day had arrived 3 hours behind schedule, and the coordination failures that would plague the Luftwaffe's grand offensive were already bleeding through radio chatter like cracks in armor. What was supposed to be a synchronized knockout blow was becoming a lesson in how even the most meticulous plans could shatter against the friction of war. At 05:30 on August 13, 1940, weather delays had already forced postponements across multiple Kampfgeschwader. Some bomber groups launched into thick cloud banks and never found their assigned targets, wandering over Kent and Surrey like lost children while RAF fighters vectored toward their engine noise. The much-anticipated Adlertag was starting to feel more like amateur hour than the beginning of Britain's destruction. Müller wiped sweat from his goggles and felt his leather gloves slip on the control stick. The heat was already unbearable, and they hadn't even taken off. Around him, other pilots sat in their cockpits like men trapped in ovens, the metal surfaces too hot to touch with bare skin. Ground crews pushed against wingtips and tailplanes, their faces red and streaming as they prepared to launch nearly 1,500 aircraft against British airfields. The Heinkel He 111 bombers of Kampfgeschwader 54 were already taxiing, their dorsal greenhouse canopies creating literal greenhouses that would cook their crews during the climb to bombing altitude. Radio operators and gunners had learned to fly in shirt sleeves, with sweat pooling in their boots before they even crossed the French coast. The metallic taste of fear mixed with the ersatz coffee they'd swallowed at the 4 a.m. briefing, served in tin mugs that still carried the bitter tang of yesterday's dregs. But the real shock came on August 15th when Luftflotte 5 launched its raids from Norwegian bases toward northern England. The crews had been briefed to expect thin defences, perhaps a handful of obsolete fighters scratching at them from below. Instead, they flew into a buzzsaw of RAF interceptors that had been carefully husbanded for exactly this moment. Over 20 German aircraft were lost in a single day, shocking air crews who had believed their own intelligence reports about British weakness. Obergefreiter Hans Kruger, rear gunner in a Heinkel that limped home with half its port aileron shot away, would later describe watching Spitfires and Hurricanes rising from northern airfields like angry wasps from a disturbed nest. His pilot held the aircraft level by wedging a screwdriver into the severed aileron cable, while Kruger braced the control surface, with his wounded arm wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage. Ground crews at Stavanger kept that screwdriver as a talisman, a reminder that survival often came down to improvisation and luck. The failure of the northern raids forced a strategic rethink. Göring personally intervened in late August, shifting tactics to crush RAF sector stations, the nerve centres of Britain's fighter defence. Biggin Hill, Kenley, Debden, and other crucial airfields became priority targets, with bomber crews briefed to hit operations rooms and runways at hour plus or minus 2 minutes. The theory was sound. Blind the British radar network and their fighters would fumble in the dark. The reality proved more resilient than German planners expected. Even when bombs cratered runways and damaged operations buildings, the British demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to repair and recover. Smoke columns visible at dawn would be replaced by signal lamps working again by dusk. German photo reconnaissance aircraft, flying their lonely missions at 8,000 to 9,000 meters, delivered high-quality stereoscopic images that revealed the maddening persistence of British repair crews. August 18th would be remembered as the hardest day, though hardest for whom depended on which uniform you wore. For the Junkers Ju 87 Stuka units, it became a day of catastrophic revelation. Seichi 77 watched more than a dozen of their aircraft destroyed in a matter of hours, the survivors describing hurricanes that filled their windscreens like a wall of metal and machine gun fire. The Jericho trumpets that had terrorized Europe became death songs over England, where radar gave defenders enough warning to position fighters for devastating intercepts. The withdrawal of Stuka units after August 18th marked the first major tactical retreat of the campaign. These precision dive bombers, which had symbolized German air power's surgical strike capability, were simply too vulnerable in British airspace. Their slow speed and fixed landing gear made them easy prey for fighters that knew exactly where and when they were coming. Meanwhile, maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep fighters airborne. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 could be turned around in 25 to 35 minutes for quick-turn scrambles, but a busy day meant 3 to 4 sorties per pilot. Mechanics chalked compression figures on engine cowls in grease pencil after each sortie, watching for signs of the fatal overheating that could claim a pilot after just 10 minutes at maximum power settings. The Daimler-Benz DB601A engines were being pushed beyond their designed limits. Under combat conditions, the average service life of a frontline 109 engine could drop below 100 hours, a catastrophic reduction that meant constant shortages and frantic maintenance schedules. Mechanics measured victory by spark plug inventory. When DB601 plugs dropped below 200 per Gruppe, grounded fighters were guaranteed within 72 hours. By early September, the strain was showing in every aspect of Luftwaffe operations. Ground crews worked 14 to 16-hour shifts, patching flak holes with doped linen and riveted doublers. Tool check counts, spanners 10, screwdrivers 6, hammers 3, were shouted hoarsely at midnight as exhausted men tried to keep aircraft airworthy through sheer determination and ersatz coffee. The breaking point came during a September 2nd conference when Göring asked his fighter aces what they needed to win the battle. Major Adolf Galland, Gruppenkommandeur of JG-26, reportedly snapped back, "Give me a squadron of Spitfires." The line rippled through mess halls by nightfall, a bitter acknowledgement that German fighter pilots were being asked to fight with inferior range and endurance against an enemy that seemed to regenerate overnight. What would you do if your commanders kept promising victory while the mathematics of fuel and physics conspired against every mission you flew? The Eagles were learning that Britain's Hawks had been waiting for them all along, and the sky over England was about to become a graveyard for both. The Thames estuary carried its own smell, a fishy tang that reached German bomber crews before they could even see the sprawling darkness of London below, while smoke columns from burning dockside warehouses climbed over 1,000 metres into the evening sky, visible from 100 kilometres away on clear September nights. September 7th, 1940, marked a fundamental shift in the Luftwaffe's campaign against Britain, a shift from the calculated targeting of military installations to the systematic bombing of civilian areas. This wasn't just a change in tactics, it was an admission that the original strategy had failed and that Germany's air force was now groping for any lever that might force British surrender. Oberfeldwebel Ernst Hoffmann felt an unexpected surge of relief as his Heinkel He 111 turned southeast toward the London docks instead of north toward RAF Biggin Hill. The switch to London meant fewer fighter raids on German forward airfields, fewer encounters with the deadly chain-home radar network that had made precision attacks on RAF sector stations so costly. Many bomber crews shared this sentiment. The capital was a bigger target, easier to find, and the British seemed less willing to defend it with the same suicidal intensity they'd shown protecting their fighter airfields. But German fighter pilots groaned when they calculated the fuel mathematics. The Messerschmitt Bf 109's effective combat radius of 125 to 160 kilometres meant that over London, a pilot might have 10% fuel reserve remaining. Any dogfight below 3,000 metres risked a ditching call, motor oars, within minutes. The dreaded Kanalkrankheit or channel sickness was spreading through fighter units. A psychological dread of ditching in the Englischer Canal, where rescue chances dropped below 1 in 2 if a pilot went down after 1,700 hours. The night of September 7th also marked the beginning of a new phase in aerial warfare, the systematic use of radio navigation beams to guide bombers through British darkness. Knickebein beam riding used narrow 30 to 32 kHz signals, only 30 metres wide, with navigators calling out needle swings while pilots held course through blacked-out skies. Field kitchens served ersatz coffee and pea soup at 0400 briefings, but the real nourishment came from the metallic taste of tin mugs and the scratchy comfort of wool flight suits that would soon be soaked with sweat. Kampfgruppe 100, the Luftwaffe's elite pathfinder unit, pioneered the X-Garrett system for intersecting radio beams that could time bomb release to the second. Their job was to drop incendiary candles that would mark aiming points amid London's blackout, creating a constellation of fires that following bomber streams could use as navigation aids. The precision was remarkable. A competent navigator could put bombs within 200 meters of a designated target while flying blind at 4,000 meters altitude. But precision bombing was becoming academic as the campaign's objectives shifted from military to psychological warfare. The delayed action fuses 17, 30 and 60-minute delays were designed to disrupt repair efforts and demoralize civilian populations rather than destroy specific military targets. German engineers were disappointed by British bomb disposal persistence. Crews that expected chaos found instead a methodical, almost mechanical response to their terror weapons. September 15th would later be designated Battle of Britain Day, though the significance was lost on German crews struggling through what felt like just another grinding day of losses. Some bomber formations reported seeing homeward streams of jettisoned bombs sparkling in sunlight as fighter controllers ordered drop-and-run maneuvers, an airborne admission that missions had gone sour before reaching their targets. The sight of those falling bombs, glittering like deadly confetti against the blue September sky, marked a psychological turning point for many German aircrews. These were men trained for precision strikes against military targets, not the indiscriminate scattering of ordnance across the English countryside in panicked retreats. Major Werner Mölders of JG-51 was refining new fighter tactics during this period, developing the Schwarm and Rotter, loose finger four formations that would become standard for the rest of the war. His diary entries note radio brevity codes and preferences for 5 to 10 degree offset climbs that maintained sight between wingmen while maximizing tactical flexibility. But even perfect tactics couldn't overcome the fundamental problem. German fighters were operating at the absolute limit of their range, while defending bombers that were increasingly being used as terror weapons rather than precision instruments. The Bf 109E's armament reflected the bitter compromises of aerial combat. Two 20mm MGFF cannons carried only 60 to 90 rounds per gun-wing-mounted drums that could be emptied in 6 seconds of continuous fire. Pilots learned to use 1 to 2 second bursts at ranges under 200 meters, but closing to effective range meant accepting the risk of British return fire and the constant pressure of dwindling fuel reserves. Night operations brought their own terrors and complications. Luftwaffe 3's strikes often used Kettenhunde chain dogs radio beacons that stepped aircraft along predetermined routes. But coastal searchlights and anti-aircraft fire created light cages that disoriented new crews and turned navigation into a deadly puzzle of intersecting beams and hostile fire. The He 111's dorsal greenhouse gave excellent rearward visibility, but temperatures under the plexiglass could exceed 50 degrees Celsius during climbs. Gunners flew in shirt sleeves with sweat pooling in their boots, while pilots dealt with the disorienting effects of flying a literal greenhouse through varying altitudes and air temperatures. Many crews taped coins or St. Christopher medals to their instrument panels, small talismans against the vast mechanical violence they flew through nightly. Ammunition mixing became an art form among fighter pilots. Many favoured Minengeschoss, thin-walled, high-explosive rounds that could peel fabric from British aircraft with 1 or 2 hits. But the limited ammunition supply meant that every burst had to count, and pilots were learning to shoot only when they were certain of hits. The psychological strain was beginning to show in ways both large and small. After one September morning, a Staffel's chalkboard listed 12 pilots at breakfast and only 7 at supper. The mess cook refused to erase the missing names until a chaplain could arrive to perform the necessary rituals. These weren't just statistics, they were empty chairs at tables where men had shared ersatz coffee and gallows humor just hours before. What would it feel like to know that every mission might be your last, while flying deeper into enemy territory with less fuel and fewer options each time? London was burning, but the Luftwaffe was burning through its experienced aircrews even faster than British cities burned through their buildings. The yellow-painted Heinkel He 59 floatplane sat low in the grey, channel swells, red crosses vivid against its fuselage, as Obergefreiter Paul Brennan scanned the water for the telltale orange of a life jacket among the whitecaps that threatened to swamp his aircraft's pontoons. The Seenaudienst Germany's Air-Sea Rescue Service had become one of the most crucial and dangerous operations of the entire Battle of Britain, fishing German and British airmen alike from water that killed as efficiently as any fighter's guns. With channel temperatures logged at 15 to 17 degrees Celsius, survival without a dinghy dropped to under 30 minutes, turning every ditching into a race against hypothermia and hope. Brennan spotted movement near a partially inflated dinghy, two figures clinging to opposite sides of the rubber boat. As his pilot maneuvered closer, spray soaking through the observation windows, Brennan realized he was looking at both a German pilot and an RAF flyer who had apparently found the same piece of salvation. The enemy pilots had been sharing a cigarette when the rescue float plane arrived, a moment of human solidarity that transcended the mechanical violence that had brought them together. Such encounters were becoming grimly routine as the Luftwaffe's losses mounted through September and October. German aircraft production of 800 to 1,000 planes per month could replace machines, but it could not quickly regenerate the trained multi-crew bomber teams that represented 2 to 3 years of experience each. A lost pilot-observer pair from KG-55 meant not just 2 empty bunks, but the destruction of irreplaceable institutional knowledge about navigation, bombing, and survival. The mathematics of attrition were becoming undeniable by late September. Luftwaffe intelligence had catastrophically underestimated RAF pilot regeneration capabilities. The British could field 250 to 300 new fighter pilots in September alone, while German training pipelines slowed under the pressure of operational demands. Every experienced German pilot shot down was increasingly difficult to replace, while British training schools continued graduating new defenders. The reality of air combat was far removed from the clean tactical diagrams drawn in briefing rooms. Lieutenant Hans Weber of the 2nd, JG-51 recorded his frustration with freer Jagd or free hunt operations in his logbook, vectors seldom aligned with bomber formations, leaving fighter pilots to burn precious fuel, weaving over bomber boxes at 4,000 to 6,000 meters altitude, only to have minutes left for actual combat when RAF interceptors finally appeared. Weather became as much an enemy as British fighters. Multiple missions were scrubbed when ceiling dropped below 300 meters and drizzle made formation flying impossible. Damp canvas covers reeked of mildew as armourers recrated bomb fuses by lantern light, their hands black with pitch from wooden crate splinters, minor injuries that stung when washed with gasoline, but nothing compared to the frustration of watching entire days slip away while the British repaired damage from previous raids. The Junkers Ju-88 crews had learned to value their aircraft's dive brakes and speed above all other characteristics. One pilot wrote in his diary that crossing the coast at 450 kilometers per hour felt like a hand pushing the fuselage forward, the only protection against interceptors that seemed to rise from every airfield south of London. But even the Ju-88's speed advantage couldn't overcome the fundamental problem of operating at maximum range against an enemy fighting over home territory. Combat narratives from this period reveal the intimate brutality of aerial warfare. A Junkers Ju-88 over Kent took a 303 round through the navigator's map table during a September raid. The bullet lodged in a chocolate bar, stopping just short of the man's spine. The crew ate the lucky ration after landing and kept the wrapper pinned to their Stuffle notice board, a talisman that somehow made the random violence of war feel manageable, if not survivable. But not all encounters ended with such dark humour. Bomb-fusing tactics had shifted toward maximum disruption rather than military precision. More 250-kilogram SD splinter bombs were being used to shred parked aircraft and ground crews, while 50-kilogram SC bombs peppered runways to force labour-intensive repairs. The goal was no longer surgical strikes against specific targets, but the systematic degradation of British morale and infrastructure. The human cost was mounting on both sides. A Heinkel He 111 of KG-1 limped home after a September raid with half its aileron shot away, the rear gunner holding the wing level by bracing a screwdriver in the severed cable run, while his arm was wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage. The ground crew kept that screwdriver as a unit talisman, but such improvised survival was becoming the exception rather than the rule. Fighter-bomber Jarbo raids began appearing in September and October, as the Luftwaffe experimented with using Messerschmitt Bf 109s to carry single 250-kilogram bombs. Pilots appreciated the speed advantage of getting in and out quickly, but hated the nose-heavy handling characteristics and the longer takeoff rolls that required an additional 150 to 200 meters of runway. More critically, the bomb load reduced already marginal fuel reserves to dangerous levels. Ground crew fatigue had reached critical levels across German airfields. Some units logged less than 5 hours of sleep during 48-hour operational periods. Tool inventories became matters of life and death. Quartermaster records show thousands of 50-kilogram bombs moved by hand, leaving workers with palms black from wooden crate splinters and the constant sting of gasoline and cordite residue. One Staffel painted a small white radar mast silhouette on its unit emblem after participating in a strike against Ventnor radar station, only to watch British repair crews bring the facility back online within days. The badge became a private joke about targets that don't die, but the humour couldn't disguise the growing realisation that British resilience exceeded German projections. The September rains turned Low Countries airfields into quagmires, where ground crews pushed bogged tail wheels with shoulder-to-spoke leverage, while engines howled at idle power settings. Drainage systems, designed for peacetime operations, collapsed under the weight of continuous flight operations, leaving mechanics to work in ankle-deep mud that sucked boots off feet and turned routine maintenance into exhausting physical labour. By October, aircrew letters home began mentioning details that suggested psychological strain. The Channel's colours steel at dawn, bottle green at noon, black at dusk, and the taste of fear when fuel warning lamps flickered, amber 20 minutes from base. These were symptoms of men pushed beyond their operational limits, flying missions that increasingly felt like elaborate forms of suicide. Could you climb into a machine every day knowing that the mathematics of fuel and distance were conspiring against your survival, while the enemy seemed to grow stronger with each passing week? The rescue services were pulling more German airmen from Channel waters than British pilots, and everyone was beginning to understand what that meant for the future of the campaign. Bright sunlight glared off the Channel's surface as Unteroffizier Karl Richter squinted through his Heinkel's plexiglass nose, dark cloth taped over his bomb sight to cut the blinding reflections that turned precision bombing into guesswork, while somewhere above him, Hermann Göring's grand strategy was unraveling faster than parachute silk in a crosswind. By late September 1940, the fault lines in German aerial doctrine were becoming impossible to ignore, and the man responsible for the Luftwaffe's failures was proving more interested in assigning blame than accepting responsibility. The disconnect between Göring's promises and battlefield reality had reached a breaking point that would reshape German air operations for the remainder of the war. Richter felt sweat sting his eyes as he adjusted the makeshift sun filter, then a piece of dark cloth that bomber crews had started taping over their optical equipment after discovering that Channel reflections could blind a bombardier at the worst possible moment. Below him, the Thames estuary spread like a brown stain against the blue-green water, but finding specific targets in London's sprawl remained a challenge that no amount of pre-mission briefing could solve. The problem started at the top. Göring had dismissed Messerschmitt Bf 110 escort failures as cowardice during increasingly bitter conferences with his unit commanders. The Zerstörer crews, already demoralised by catastrophic losses, responded that they were flying targets without tight Bf 109 top cover. The twin-engine fighters that looked so formidable in peacetime exercises had proven helpless against RAF interceptors that exploited every weakness in German tactical doctrine. But the Reichsmarschall's tirades couldn't change the mathematics of aerial combat. German signals traffic was successfully intercepting British sector call signs Kenley, Hornchurch, Biggin, but completely misreading the resilience of the Dowding system. Knocking out a runway did not blind radar plots that continued operating from underground facilities and mobile units. Cratering an operations building did not silence radio networks that rerouted through backup stations within hours. The intelligence failures went deeper than tactical misunderstanding. German photo reconnaissance units, flying their lonely missions in Dornier Do 17P aircraft and later Bf 109 E5s, delivered stereoscopic images of remarkable quality from altitudes of 8 to 9,000 meters. Analysts at Cormeilles and St. Paul could count blast patches and aircraft dispersals with precision that would have been impossible just 5 years earlier. But they consistently underestimated British repair capabilities and the redundancy built into chain-home radar coverage. Major Wolfgang Schmidt of Aufklärungsgruppe 31 had photographed Biggin Hill during the devastating August 30th strike, capturing images of shattered buildings and cratered runways that seemed to confirm German tactical success. But follow-up reconnaissance 48 hours later showed signal lamps working again, aircraft dispersed to satellite fields, and ground crews filling bomb craters with mechanical persistence that defied German expectations. The Luftwaffe's own maintenance challenges were becoming as serious as British resilience. Airfields in the Low Countries suffered drainage failures that turned September rains into operational disasters. Ground crews at Lille and Brussels-Aver pushed bogged tailwheels with desperate manual labour, shoulders braced against wheel spokes while engines howled at idle power settings. What had been routine maintenance in peacetime became exhausting physical labour that left men too tired to perform precision work on complex aircraft systems. Ammunition logistics revealed another layer of German miscalculation. Luftwaffe quartermasters were moving thousands of 50-kilogram bombs by hand, leaving workers with palms black from wooden crate splinters that stung when exposed to gasoline residue. The glamorous image of aerial warfare had devolved into manual labor that would have been familiar to any factory worker, except that these factories were subject to RAF bombing raids that could kill everyone in a hangar with a single, direct hit. The psychological pressure was manifesting in ways both subtle and dramatic. In bright sunlight, bomber gunners struggled with glare that made target identification nearly impossible. Crews improvised solutions, dark cloth over sights, pencil smoke on plexiglass blisters, even coins taped to instrument panels as improvised sun shields. These weren't innovations born of engineering brilliance, but desperate adaptations to conditions that had never been anticipated during training. Individual acts of courage became legendary among German air crews, but they couldn't disguise the systematic failure of German air doctrine. A gallon cigar famously remained clenched during combat landings, leading ground crews to joke that their Gruppenkommandeur could scramble the tobacco, a myth that boosted esprit de corps even when fuel and nerves ran dangerously low. But such personal legends couldn't overcome the fundamental problem. The Luftwaffe was fighting the wrong battle with inadequate resources. Weather became an increasingly decisive factor as autumn approached. Multiple days of sealing below 300 meters and persistent drizzle forced mass cancellations across German airfields. Damp canvas hangar covers developed the sweet-sick smell of mildew, while armourers recrated sensitive bomb fuses by lantern light, their work complicated by moisture that could turn explosive ordnance into expensive scrap metal. The British adaptation to German night bombing tactics demonstrated a level of systematic learning that German commanders had not anticipated. Chain-home radars that had been designed for daylight interception were being supplemented by mobile units and improved radio communication networks. British fighter controllers were learning to stack Hurricanes low and Spitfires high, creating layered defences that could engage both high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft and low-level attack formations. By October, German bomber crews were reporting fuel calculations that left no margin for error. From Pas-de-Calais bases to London and back, a Heinkel He 111 carrying 3/4 of its maximum bomb load would have perhaps 10% fuel remaining, assuming no combat manoeuvring, no weather delays, and perfect navigation. Any engagement with RAF fighters below 3,000 meters altitude virtually guaranteed a ditching call within minutes of combat. The human cost was becoming impossible to ignore. German casualty returns listed thousands of airmen killed, wounded, or captured, their parachutes described by British civilians as dandelions, blossoming over Sussex fields. The sweet acrid smell of silk and cordite became associated with defeat rather than victory, a sensory reminder that German air power was bleeding experienced personnel faster than training schools could replace them. Can you imagine flying missions knowing that your own commanders were more interested in political theatre than tactical reality, while every sortie pushed you closer to mathematical certainty of capture or death? The Reichsmarshal's gamble was failing, but Göring seemed determined to double down rather than admit the fundamental flaws in his strategy. The narrow radio beam was only 30 meters wide at 8,000 feet, but Obergefreiter Anton Weiss could hear his navigator's voice crack with exhaustion as he called out needle swings through the Knickebein guidance system, their Heinkel He 111 threading through British darkness toward targets they could not see but hoped desperately to hit. By October 1940, the Luftwaffe had abandoned any pretense of daylight precision bombing and committed fully to night operations, a tactical admission that German air power could no longer survive in contested skies. What had begun as Eagle Day's coordinated knockout blow had devolved into a grinding campaign of attrition fought in darkness, where navigation errors could scatter bombs across empty countryside, and mechanical failures meant certain death in the Channel's black water. Weiss felt the familiar knot of nausea that came with night flying, as his pilot banked to follow the invisible electronic highway that German engineers had constructed across the Channel. The Knickebein system used intersecting radio beams to guide bombers to their targets with mathematical precision, but the technology that looked so promising in peacetime exercises proved far more fragile under combat conditions. Static from British jamming efforts could turn the narrow guidance beam into useless noise, leaving bomber crews to navigate by dead reckoning through hostile airspace. Kampfgruppe 100 had pioneered the even more sophisticated X-Gerät system, 4 intersecting radio beams that could time bomb release to the second. Their Heinkel He 111 Pathfinder aircraft carried special radio equipment and highly trained navigators capable of dropping incendiary markers within 200 meters of designated targets. The theory was elegant. Pathfinders would light up target areas with incendiary candles, creating navigation aids that following bomber streams could use to concentrate their ordnance with devastating effect. The reality proved more complicated. British blackout discipline had eliminated most of the visual references that German crews had trained with during peacetime exercises. London at night became a vast ocean of darkness, punctuated only by searchlight beams and the occasional flash of anti-aircraft fire. Even experienced Pathfinder crews found themselves dropping markers on empty fields or industrial areas that bore no resemblance to their intended targets. Weather conditions that would have been minor inconveniences during daylight operations became life-threatening hazards at night. Icing conditions could coat aircraft surfaces with deadly weight while making flight instruments unreliable. Cloud layers that obscured radio navigation beams forced crews to choose between flying blind at dangerous altitudes or descending into the range of British anti-aircraft guns that had learned to coordinate their fire with searchlight. Concentrations. The psychological strain of night operations was becoming evident in aircrew behavior and performance. Fuel calculations that had been merely unforgiving during daylight missions became exercises in desperation after dark. A Heinkel He 111 flying from Brussels to London and back would typically land with fuel gauges showing empty engines coughing on vapour fumes that meant the difference between survival and a channel ditching. Ground crews were working extended shifts that pushed human endurance beyond sustainable limits. Some maintenance units logged less than 5 hours of sleep during 48-hour operational periods, with mechanics performing complex engine work by flashlight and kerosene lantern. Tool inventories became matters of life and death. When specialized equipment was lost or damaged, aircraft remained grounded until replacement parts could be located and transported from Germany. The human cost was mounting in ways that German casualty statistics could not adequately capture. One Staffel's chalkboard famously listed 12 pilots at breakfast and only 7 at supper after a particularly devastating September raid. The mess cook refused to erase the missing names until a military chaplain could arrive to perform the necessary rituals, a small act of defiance that spoke to the growing realization that German air power was consuming itself. Individual acts of heroism and survival became legendary among German aircrews, but they could not disguise the systematic failure of German strategic planning. A Junkers Ju 88 over Kent had taken a 303 round through the navigator's map table during one October mission. The bullet lodged in a chocolate bar, stopping just short of the navigator's spine. The crew ate the lucky chocolate bar after landing and kept the wrapper pinned to their Staffel notice board, a talisman that somehow made the random violence of aerial warfare feel manageable. But such stories of miraculous survival were becoming increasingly rare compared to reports of aircraft that simply disappeared into channel darkness without radio contact or distress calls. The Seenotdienst rescue units were finding fewer survivors and more wreckage, evidence of the grinding attrition that was consuming Germany's most experienced multi-engine aircrews faster than training schools could replace them. Navigation equipment that had been reliable during the conquest of France and the Low Countries proved inadequate for sustained operations over Britain. Radio compass bearings could be distorted by British jamming transmitters, while magnetic compasses were affected by the metal mass of bomb loads and defensive armament. Crews learned to cross-check multiple navigation methods, but the added workload increased fatigue and reduced accuracy when precision was most crucial. The shift to night operations also revealed fundamental flaws in German aircraft design that had been masked by earlier tactical successes. The Heinkel He 111's dorsal greenhouse that provided excellent visibility during daylight bombing became a liability at night, when internal lighting could destroy night vision and make aircraft visible to British fighters from kilometers away. Crews learned to operate essential systems by touch while maintaining strict light discipline, but the added complexity reduced operational efficiency and increased the likelihood of navigation errors. Bomber defensive armament that had been adequate against Polish and French interceptors proved insufficient against RAF night fighters, equipped with primitive but effective airborne radar systems. German gunners reported British fighters approaching from angles that should have been impossible without visual contact, suggesting that the Royal Air Force had developed technological capabilities that German intelligence had failed to anticipate. By late October, aircrew letters home were beginning to mention details that suggested the campaign was not progressing according to official projections. References to the channel's changing colours, steel at dawn, bottle green at noon, black at dusk, and descriptions of fuel warning lights flickering amber 20 minutes from base suggested psychological strain that went far beyond normal combat fatigue. How would it feel to fly into enemy darkness every night, knowing that your navigation equipment might fail, your fuel might run out, and your rescue chances decreased with every mile from the French coast. The hunters had become the hunted, and British darkness was proving more dangerous than German daylight had ever been. A maintenance chief at Lille counted spark plugs with the methodical precision of an undertaker tallying coffins, knowing that when Daimler-Benz DB601 plugs dropped below 200 per gruppe, he could predict grounded Messerschmitt Bf 109s within 72 hours. Logistics had become destiny, and destiny was running out of spare parts. By late October 1940, the brutal arithmetic of aerial warfare had reduced German air operations to an equation that no amount of propaganda could solve. Aircraft production of 800 to 1,000 planes per month could replace machines, but Germany's training pipelines could not regenerate the experienced multi-crew bomber teams that represented 2 to 3 years of institutional knowledge per aircraft. The Luftwaffe was consuming itself faster than it could regenerate. Obergefreiter Klaus Müller watched mechanics work by kerosene lantern as October rains turned Belgian airfields into quagmires that sucked boots off feet and made routine maintenance an exercise in exhaustion. Ground crews were logging 14 to 16-hour shifts, patching flak holes with doped linen and riveted aluminum doublers, their hands black with pitch from wooden ammunition crates and stinging from constant exposure to aviation gasoline residue. The human cost was becoming impossible to disguise. Historian tallies would later estimate Luftwaffe losses from July through October at between 1,700 and 1,900 aircraft, though exact numbers remain disputed due to the chaos of combat record-keeping. More significant than machine losses was the gutting of experienced aircrew rosters bomber. Gruppen like KG-55 saw their crew list decimated by 25 to 40% during peak operational weeks. Müller had learned to measure defeat in small concrete details. Tool-check inventories that had once been routine became desperate exercises in resource management. Spanners 10, screwdrivers 6, hammers 3. The hoarse midnight counts of exhausted ground crews trying to keep aircraft airworthy through determination and ersatz coffee that tasted like burnt acorns and industrial alcohol. The weather had become as much an enemy as RAF Fighter Command. Multiple missions were scrubbed when ceiling dropped below 300 meters and persistent drizzle made formation flying suicidal. Damp canvas hangar covers developed the sweet sick smell of mildew, while armorers worked by lantern light to recreate bomb fuses that moisture could turn into expensive scrap metal. October rains had transformed airfield drainage systems, designed for peacetime operations, into ankle-deep mud that claimed more aircraft-to-ground accidents than enemy fire. German fighter pilots were reporting fuel calculations that left no margin for survival. From Pas-de-Calais to London and back, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 would typically land with fuel gauges showing empty engines coughing on vapor fumes. Any combat maneuvering below 3,000 meters altitude virtually guaranteed a ditching call, Motorross, within minutes of engagement with RAF interceptors. The Daimler-Benz DB601, engines that powered Germany's primary fighter, were being pushed beyond all designed operational limits. Under continuous combat conditions, average engine life could drop below 100 hours, a catastrophic reduction that meant constant shortages and maintenance schedules that consumed more man-hours than combat operations. Mechanics were chalking compression readings on engine cowls with grease pencils, watching for the fatal signs of bearing failure that would ground aircraft indefinitely. Individual survival stories had taken on the quality of dark fairy tales among German aircrews. The He-59 air-sea rescue floatplane that had picked up both German and RAF pilots clinging to the same rubber dinghy became legendary. 2 enemy aviators sharing a cigarette while waiting for rescue. A moment of human solidarity that transcended the mechanical violence of aerial warfare. But such encounters were becoming increasingly rare as rescue operations struggled to cover the expanding area of Channel wreckage. The night bombing campaign that had begun as a precision operation using sophisticated radio navigation was degenerating into area bombardment that achieved little beyond terrorizing civilians and consuming Germany's remaining experienced bomber crews. Knickebein and X-Garret beam guidance systems that looked elegant in peacetime exercises proved vulnerable to British jamming efforts that could turn precise navigation into random destruction. Navigation errors were scattering German bombs across empty countryside, while British repair crews demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to restore damaged facilities within hours of attack. Photo reconnaissance aircraft flying at 8,000 to 9,000 meters delivered stereoscopic images of remarkable clarity, but the pictures consistently showed British infrastructure regenerating faster than German attacks could destroy it. Kampfgruppe, 100 Pathfinder aircraft, equipped with the most sophisticated radio navigation equipment available, were dropping incendiary markers hundreds of meters from intended targets, creating navigation aids that guided following bomber streams to empty fields and residential areas rather than military installations. The mathematical precision that German engineers had promised was being defeated by atmospheric interference, equipment failure, and the simple human impossibility of precise navigation through hostile darkness. By October 31st, 1940, the aerial campaign had officially transitioned into what would become known as the Winter Blitz, a tacit admission that the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority over Britain and would henceforth be limited to night harassment, operations that could not decisively influence the war's outcome. Many Luftwaffe veterans would later describe the period as winning the days but losing the war's direction, a recognition that tactical successes in individual combat encounters could not overcome strategic failure at the campaign level. German pilots had proven their individual courage and skill, but courage could not overcome fuel limitations, mechanical failures, and the mathematical certainty of attrition warfare fought at the extreme limits of operational range. Aircrew letters home during this period mentioned details that revealed psychological strain beyond normal combat fatigue. Descriptions of the channels changing colors, steel at dawn, bottle green at noon, black at dusk, and references to fuel warning lights, flickering amber 20 minutes from base, that suggested men who had been pushed beyond their operational limits and were beginning to understand the implications of mathematical defeat. The taste of fear when fuel gauges approached empty had become as familiar as ersatz coffee and the metallic tang of oxygen masks. German pilots were learning that mechanical precision could not overcome the fundamental problem of fighting a defensive enemy over their home territory while operating at maximum range with minimal reserves. Could you continue flying missions, knowing that every sortie was consuming irreplaceable resources while achieving objectives that grew smaller and less meaningful with each passing week? The Eagles had discovered that mathematics, not courage, would determine the outcome of their battle with Britain's Hawks. The last Messerschmitt Bf 109 of October 31st, 1940, landed at Marquis Ost with its fuel gauge needle trembling on empty. The engine coughing on vapours as Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann shut down, what would officially mark the end of the Battle of Britain, though few German pilots realized they had just participated in their Air Force's first decisive defeat. The mathematics of failure had become undeniable by Halloween 1940, but the human cost would echo through German aircrew barracks for the remainder of the war. What had begun as Hermann Göring's promise of swift victory through air power alone had devolved into a grinding campaign of attrition that consumed Germany's most experienced pilots and aircrew faster than training schools could replace them. The Eagles had been grounded not by enemy fighters alone, but by the inexorable arithmetic of fuel consumption, engine wear, and replacement rates. Hoffmann climbed from his cockpit with hands that shook from more than cold October air. Around him, ground crews moved with the mechanical precision of men who had learned to work through exhaustion, their faces grey with fatigue, and the growing realization that the promises of easy victory had been lies built on wishful thinking rather than operational reality. The sweet smell of aviation gasoline mixed with the acrid odor of burnt oil and the metallic tang of cordite residue that seemed to penetrate everything on German airfields. The transition to what would become known as the Winter Blitz represented more than a seasonal change in tactics. It was a fundamental admission that German air doctrine had failed to achieve its primary objective. Britain had not been bombed into submission, RAF Fighter Command had not been destroyed, and the invasion barges massed in Channel ports would soon be dispersed to avoid RAF bombing attacks. The Luftwaffe would continue night harassment operations through the winter months, but these were strategic afterthoughts rather than decisive military actions. Individual stories of survival and loss had taken on mythological proportions among German aircrews struggling to understand what had gone wrong. The screwdriver that had held together a damaged Heinkel's aileron cables was still mounted in the Staffel's ready room, polished by handling until it gleamed like a religious relic. The chocolate bar wrapper that had stopped a 303 bullet remained pinned to a notice board at Brussels-Aver, surrounded by photographs of men who would never return from Channel crossings. But such talismans could not overcome the fundamental flaws in German strategic planning that had become apparent during 4 months of sustained operations. The chain-home radar network that German intelligence had dismissed as primitive technology had proven remarkably resilient to bombing attacks. Radar stations that appeared destroyed in aerial photographs were operating again within 24 to 72 hours, their steel lattice towers continuing to track German formations with mechanical persistence. The human dimension of defeat was visible in details that no official casualty statistics could capture. Mess halls that had seated full squadrons in July were serving meals to half-empty tables by October's end. The chalkboards that recorded pilot assignments showed names crossed out in pencil, then erased completely, then replaced with new names that would themselves be erased within weeks. German aircrews had learned to avoid forming close friendships with replacement pilots whose survival could be measured in days rather than months. Aircraft maintenance that had been routine during the conquest of France and the Low Countries had become an exercise in mechanical desperation. Ground crews were cannibalizing engines from crashed aircraft to keep operational machines airworthy, stripping parts with the systematic efficiency of vultures picking over carcasses. Spark plug inventories that maintenance chiefs had once taken for granted became the limiting factor in flight operations, with grounded aircraft waiting weeks for replacement parts that might never arrive. The psychological impact of sustained operations at maximum range had created what German medical officers were beginning to recognize as a distinct form of combat fatigue. Kanalkrankheit, channel sickness, affected pilots who had survived multiple ditching attempts or witnessed too many comrades disappear into the grey water between England and France. The symptoms included insomnia, loss of appetite, and a persistent dread of fuel warning lights that could mean the difference between survival and death in icy channel water. Weather that had been merely inconvenient during the summer months became operationally decisive as autumn progressed into winter. Low clouds, persistent drizzle, and icing conditions forced mass cancellations of bombing raids that had been planned for weeks. Damp hangars developed the musty smell of mildew and decay, while aircraft sat covered by canvas tarpaulins that absorbed moisture and added unnecessary weight to machines already operating at their performance limits. The night bombing operations that continued into 1941 would achieve tactical successes in terms of civilian casualties and infrastructure damage, but they could not accomplish the strategic objective of forcing British surrender. German crews flying Knickebein and Ex-Garret guided missions would continue to demonstrate remarkable precision under combat conditions, but precision bombing of civilian targets could not overcome British industrial capacity and military resilience. Many Luftwaffe veterans would spend the remainder of the war reflecting on those 4 months when German air power had seemed capable of achieving decisive victory through aerial bombardment alone. Their later assessment, "We won the days but lost the war's direction," captured the fundamental disconnect between tactical success in individual combat encounters and strategic failure at the campaign level. The taste of defeat was as distinctive as ersatz coffee and aviation gasoline. German pilots who had learned to fear fuel warning lights, flickering amber 20 minutes from base, would carry that specific anxiety through subsequent campaigns in Russia, North Africa, and eventually the defense of Germany itself. The Channel's changing colors, steel at dawn, bottle green at noon, black at dusk, would remain vivid in veteran memories long after the war's end. Aircraft that had seemed invincible during the conquest of Poland and France had proven vulnerable to an enemy fighting over familiar territory, with adequate warning systems and redundant command structures. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka that had terrorized European civilians became a liability in British airspace, while the Messerschmitt Bf 110 Zerstörer, designed to escort bombers, required escorts of its own. By November 1st, 1940, German aircrew casualties numbered in the thousands of killed, wounded, and captured losses that represented years of training and experience that could not be quickly replaced. The parachutes that had blossomed over Sussex fields during the battle's peak weeks were described by British civilians as looking like dandelions in spring meadows, a pastoral metaphor that disguised the human tragedy of each individual descent toward captivity or death. The final irony was that German air power, which had seemed so dominant during the early war years, had been defeated not by superior British technology or tactics, but by the basic limitations of fuel consumption and operational range that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. What legacy would you leave if your greatest moment of apparent strength revealed the fundamental weaknesses that would define all your future battles? The Battle of Britain had ended, but its lessons would reshape aerial warfare for the remainder of the Second World War. Lessons written in the empty chairs of German mess halls, and the growing realization that air power alone could not win wars against determined opponents fighting for their homeland.